So, good afternoon and a very warm welcome to this EPC update, our regular look at key developments in and around the European Union in the time of the COVID-19 pandemic. My name is Jacki Davis. I'm a senior advisor to the EPC, and with me this week, as always, are Janis Emmanouilidis, Director of Studies at the EPC, and Fabian Zuleeg, Chief Executive of the EPC, and our special guest later on in the event is Sophie Pornschlegel, who is Connecting Europe project leader and a senior policy analyst at the EPC. And she's going to join us for a discussion in the second half of this week's update on the outcome of the CDU leadership election in Germany, the prospects for the federal elections in September, and what all of this means for the EU. But we're going to start by discussing the latest developments in the EU's response to the COVID-19 pandemic, focusing on the outcome of last night's video conference of EU leaders. As always, it's a totally interactive discussion, questions from me, and then I hope later on from all of you. Two options if you want to ask a question. You're all muted for now. You can click on the Q&A button, please, not the chat button, and write your question, and please keep it brief. And click on the raise hands buttons if you want to speak, and I will give you the floor and ask you at that point to activate your microphone. Not your camera, just your microphone. So if you're watching us in your jimmy jammies, don't worry, we're not going to know. And finally, please use the chat box if you have any IT issues and need some help. You can't hear us, you can't see us. So let us turn first to the COVID response and what happened at last night's video conference call. A number of issues were discussed. Before we go into the detail of that, Janis, in terms of the overall outcome, did we move much further? Have we made progress in terms of a more common, a more harmonized approach to these issues?
Well, yes, there has been some progress, rather limited, but still there is some progress. As we all know, these video conferences, especially when they deal with the coordination on the COVID-19 situation, have become part of a regular exchange between member states, between the heads of state and government, which I think is a positive thing, that you have this coordination at the highest political level. And what you can definitely feel in the days, but also yesterday itself, was that there's an increasing worry, a worry that the virus situation might spiral out of control, that the new, much more contagious strains of the virus is something which everyone is very worried about, that there might even be more potential mutations in case the situation spirals out of control. But we could also see, as we have seen in the past, that there are limits to the cooperation, that it is under pressure. That the member states, that the EU leaders are ready to agree on certain things, but even then, we see how difficult it is. We know the competence structures, meaning that the European Union's levels competences are rather limited, and it's national, even subnational players who are calling the shots. And I think also with respect to some of the things which were decided yesterday, discussed and decided yesterday, we will see how things will be implemented, because there's a list of to-dos which the Commission has to work on and then have to be implemented at national level.
But you feel, as you said, limits to that cooperation. They tend to only do it, as in so many areas, when their back is against the wall. But some progress being made. Fabian, overall, there has been a bit of a blame game going on over the last week or two, over the rollout of the vaccines. Is it the Commission's fault and related to the procurement of them? Is it to do with the member states? But overall, what is your assessment of where we are in terms of the EU's handling of this issue? And then, as I say, we'll delve into some of the specifics.
I think the starting point for this has to be a reflection on where we are overall in relation to COVID-19. And I think what we're seeing now is a good deal of frustration. Frustration because I think the hope was that vaccination could begin earlier, could be faster, could have much more of a decisive impact. The hope was also that around Christmas things would get easier. And instead we have these new strains of the virus. We have difficulties. We shouldn't forget that this is an unprecedented situation where things are not going to work smoothly at all times. But I think some of that frustration is now being felt both at European level and as national level. We also see a lot of debate in many countries around the failures as they are seen by some of governments in dealing with this situation. So overall, I think we are in just a much more short-tempered, much more difficult situation, and that is creating some of these effects. I think, yes, in an ideal world, we would have a faster rollout, we would have faster processes. But the question is always, what is the alternative, or what is an alternative outcome? What would happen, for example, if we roll out a vaccine, which then proves to be unsafe, or
Yeah.
which then proves to be less effective than was said beforehand? What would that then do also to, for example, the willingness of people to be vaccinated? So it's a
Indeed.
very delicate,
Yeah.
difficult game.
Indeed, Janis, and I think the EU leaders did focus quite a lot on the authorization of vaccines yesterday, seeing this as an area where maybe some things could be speeded up. But then there is that delicate balance of public trust in the process. But on this question of how to accelerate, what concretely, if anything, did they agree? And in terms of this blame game, I mean, the Commission is saying, look, our job is we've jointly done the procurement, that was successful. It's the member states who have to deploy. And so if there are problems, if it is slow, don't look at us, look at yourselves. Is that fair? Is that right?
Well, I think that everyone has to look at at his or her own courtyard, because everyone has made mistakes. One could argue that more of the vaccines from Pfizer BioNTech should have been ordered when they were ordered. Things should have happened earlier than when deals were struck with the different pharmaceutical companies. But then you also see that that there is a late start of the vaccination, because we needed to approve it collectively at EU 27 level. And so that came later than, for example, it was approved for in the case of Israel, which is not far ahead of us. There are problems within the member states, even, issues related to data security. To reach out to people. Are you allowed to reach out? How do you get the data of individuals when you want to contact them is an issue in some countries. Then some companies, including Pfizer, have been not able to live up to their obligations. They are modernizing some of their factories in Belgium, which takes them longer to come up with the vaccines and then to have it distributed among member states. So I think that the responsibilities, I think you can see them everywhere, and everyone needs to be careful in being critical of the other.
So what concretely did they focus on last night, and did they make any progress in addressing these issues?
Well, first of all, I think what is important is that there is an agreement with what the Commission has set out the objective should be. And that 70% of the entire adult population should be vaccinated by the summer. 80% of the over 80-year-olds and 80% of health and social care professionals should be vaccinated by March. So there is an agreement that this is what the objective should be about. And if you look into the total numbers of vaccines which have been ordered and how they will be delivered, I think that this is a target which potentially can be reached. It is a very ambitious goal, but in terms of the number of vaccines that will be available towards the end of the first and the second and the third quarter, there will be enough vaccine material to be provided to people. But still, at least they have now agreed on the objective. And in more concrete terms, we will see that there will be an approval of the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine by the end of January. There are some who said we should potentially speed up things, but others being more cautious. But the expectation is that on 29th of January, there will be agreement. So there will be a third vaccine available. Then the approval of the Johnson & Johnson vaccination is also progressing, that you will have an approval by the European Medical Agency by early March. So this would already give a boost because you would have more vaccines at your disposal. That there are ideas that the shipment of vaccines might even start before they have officially been approved. That was an idea which was strongly put forward by the Danish Prime Minister, others being more cautious on that in that field. And there is increasing pressures on companies to deliver what they had agreed that they would do, especially on Pfizer. As I said earlier, they're modernizing the core factory in Europe at the present time. So there's pressure on them to live up to what has been signed with them.
Okay, that was also a bit of rumbling in the background. I mean, some member states have also signed their own deals with pharmaceutical companies, Fabian, and there's been a little bit of niggle and resentment about that. But people say the Commission has always made it clear you can join our procurement and you can do your own thing. But there was some rumbling about Viktor Orban in the margins of the video conference last night. What is the concern? What has he said that is causing concern?
I think the issue here is, one is the general issue about member states going it alone. And while this has always been a possibility, there was a kind of tacit understanding that we should try to avoid that, that it should look like there are too many national initiatives which are going across the European approach. But in this particular case, I think the additional concern is that we are here talking about the Russian vaccine, Sputnik, which there are very significant concerns about. It is not one of the vaccines which is anywhere near approval. It's not even on the radar of the European Medicines Agency. So there's a real concern that if we are adding things to the mix, which also are likely to be perceived differently by the public, that could really undermine the overall effort. And the fear that trust in vaccination, trust in the whole process, could be eroded not just in Hungary, but across the European Union. If something goes wrong with a vaccine, that would be the worst case scenario. So certainly this intervention has not been seen as helpful.
Okay, let's turn now to the question of travel restrictions. Free movement, not much of that at the moment. And this balance between putting controls on movement, but also keeping borders open, because many member states arguing very strongly that really we have to try to keep borders open at all costs. But Belgium, for example, one of those pushing very hard for agreement that non-essential travel can and maybe should be banned. Janis, where did we get to on that? And was there any discussion around, was the focus on the borders themselves and bans, or was it more on the rules for quarantining, the rules for testing, and can we come to something common? Because it's still pretty chaotic that across Europe at the moment.
Well, that was probably the issue, the core issue which was discussed, because there is a strong fear that, as you were indicating, that some member states might go back to border closures, that we might have a repeat of what we saw in the spring of 2020, which is what everyone wants to avoid. So the agreement which was found yesterday is that the borders will be kept open, but that non-essential travel or non-essential movement will be limited, and I quote here, in a coordinated way. That's how Charles Michel was calling it. In a coordinated way, we will try to limit non-essential travel. The Commission will come up with new safety measures to coordinate potential travel restrictions. And I think the biggest innovation would be if there is an introduction of what they now call the dark red category. Up till now, we've had red, orange, and green, which in many ways was hiding some of the differences between, but also within member states, because we had seen a map which was red in almost all instances. So how much did that actually portray the realities within member states, within different regions, and obviously across borders? So there's this idea of introducing this new dark red category and linking to the dark red zones potential measures that will have to be taken when there is travel from these dark red zones to other zones in the European Union, which includes taking a PCR test before you depart from the country, from the dark red zone, and that there will be also a quarantine on arrival. Now, some might say, but this is already happening. In certain member states, this is what the rule is. You can only enter once there is a test which you've taken before you've left. But this is the idea, is that you would make this in a more coordinated fashion, that everyone would follow that rule, because the fear is that if certain member states deviate from how others are treating the problem, and the escalating problem now with the new virus variant, and that might increase disparities between member states, between regions, and that would create problems. You were referring to the Belgians, but it was also interesting to see that the German government, and Angela Merkel herself, was highlighting we might have to even impose certain much more restrictive measures if certain countries are not living up to what we are doing on our side of the border.
Exactly, it's the
So there's
countries
pressure
that are
coming from different.
who are pushing hard for others to do the same. But Fabian, how worrying would it be if we go back to the situation we saw during the first wave of border closures without any coordination of restrictions? How concerned should we be about that? Or should we continue to say exceptional times, exceptional measures? This is not a great fundamental threat to the whole principle of still the principle they've tried to maintain of free movement within the EU?
I think we have to firstly make a distinction between the openness of borders in the sense of people and in the sense of goods. Because in the first wave, we also had initially issues around borders being closed for goods. I think that is no longer a real concern. I think there we have the mechanisms in place. When it comes to people, and here again, it's non-essential travel, which we are talking about, then there is going to be a continuing struggle to make sure that there's a common approach, because also the incidence of COVID continues to differ quite strongly between different regions, different countries. And that will always, to some extent, drive the response. And unfortunately, I think we are in a situation, particularly with the new variant, that we will continue to see this up and down of the figures in many places, where any release of the restrictions then leads to an increase in the numbers, which then leads to a strong response in terms of lockdown. And that is very hard to coordinate between different places. So I think what we are moving towards is some form of common understanding that when we have these kind of high incidences, the high virulence, which we are seeing now, that there is a necessity to close borders, to have physical restrictions, both within these regions and towards other parts of the European Union. And I don't see this as something which has a long-term impact. This is simply the necessity of this virus, which is driving that.
Absolutely. One other issue, and it sort of links to that, that was discussed or was raised, particularly by Greece, but also backed by Malta and Portugal, was the issue of what you might call vaccine passports, vaccine certificates, which would mean that if you had received the vaccine, you would be able to travel freely around the European Union. Janis, this has provoked very strong reactions on both sides. Some people saying, yes, it's going to be essential, otherwise we can't get people moving again, and we need to take advantage of the fact as a growing proportion of the population is vaccinated, keeps tourism alive and so on. And on the other side, people saying we can't do that. Number one, we can't force people to be vaccinated. Number two, the rollout is proceeding at different paces in different countries, so you would leave some segments of the European population distinctly disadvantaged. Where did they get to with that last night? Was there any consensus at all on whether this idea is a runner or not?
Well, first of all, this was the beginning of a discussion. As you were indicating, there are some member states which are supportive of the Greek proposal. But there are a lot of member states, the French being the most critical, and that this would be sending the wrong signal at this point in time, in a country especially which is struggling to roll out and to have people vaccinated. And there's also the World Health Organization, which has been critical of the idea of having vaccination certificate, passport, call it whatever you may. So there are good reasons, I think, to be critical. However, having said that, I think that we have seen over the past year that we have not had this debates on similar issues early enough.
Yeah.
So I believe that it's the right thing that we have started a debate, that we're discussing the issue, because we will come at a certain point to a level of vaccination which will be high enough to think of, so what does that mean now in more concrete terms? What they agreed yesterday was that these kind of certificates would only be used for medical reasons. So it's certifying that you have been vaccinated for medical reasons. But at a later point, there will have to also be a discussion of how to apply vaccination certificates. So will they actually be able to then loosen the ability of people to travel who have been vaccinated? What other things might be linked to the fact that you have been vaccinated? But that is something which has to be discussed later in time.
Okay.
The Commission will come up again with some proposals, some ideas of what could be done in this context. So I think what was discussed yesterday, the compromise which was found, I think is a good compromise. You have the discussion getting started, a discussion which you need. You now agree on a minimal, which is the medical reasons, the logic, but then have in mind that at a certain point, once more people will have been vaccinated, we need to think of how we're going to use these certificates. And by the way, because there was a lot of comparison being made to discussion we've had earlier in 2020, when people were saying, well, if you've had the virus, should you also not be able to have some ways of doing things because you have antibodies?
Yeah.
That was a totally different discussion, because at the time there were some people who were saying, oh, it would be great for me to get the virus to have antibodies to do ABC. Now we're talking about something which is linked to something. If you get vaccinated, it is safe. So you get a certificate which is not putting you at risk. The question is how you use that instrument.
Well, also because of the question marks over the degree to which even vaccinated, you can put others at risk. You can catch it, pass it on, even if you don't suffer. We're going to move on shortly, but I have a question for you, Fabian. And if anyone has a question to this topic, if you could indicate to me now, write it in the Q&A box or raise your hand, because then we're going to move on to Germany and the federal elections. But Fabian, my question to you is a broader one, and it's about the image of the EU, because we have talked a lot about when it comes to the economic impact of COVID and the importance of that very dramatic and significant agreement last year on the recovery plan, and how the EU showed how relevant it was and that it was part of the answer. But this argument, blame game over the vaccines has led some to be seeing the EU as part of the problem. How important do you think it is? What can the EU do now to make sure that this impression isn't left, that actually the EU is holding people back from something that they see as the great moment of liberation from the most terrible year that we've had? I mean, are you worried about the impact this is having, whether it's fair or not? It is having an impact, it would seem, on public opinion and attitudes towards the European Union.
Let me just say one thing on the vaccination
Sure.
part before I answer that. I think what is important also to recognize is that once we move beyond the priority groups, then it will become a question not just for European travel. The question will be, how do you handle a situation where some people are vaccinated? Are they allowed to go onto planes where others aren't? Are they allowed to go to work where others aren't? Are they allowed to bring their children to school? So this is a much wider societal question about how do we deal with a situation where a significant part of the population is vaccinated and a significant part is not. And that will be something very difficult to handle. So the European debate on that is actually only one small dimension of a societal debate, which we will have to have in every member state. On the image of the EU, I think this is It is concerning, but I don't think it's irrecoverable. I think the situation will very much depend on how this situation in Europe develops over the next month, and whether people feel that not necessarily that we go back to normal. I think that will take some more time, but that we are moving along the right path, and that this is the overall direction is being helped by the coordination, by the cooperation at the EU level. And here I think it's always important to emphasize that who is actually the EU? Are we talking about the institutions, or are we talking about the member states cooperating within the framework of the European Union? And I think very often we're finding that many of the issues we have now come from the fact that we have different member states which have different ideas of what should be happening, and who are not necessarily willing to cooperate on some of these. And in the end, I think it also points for me to a more fundamental discussion we have to have about what are the things which we want to do together at the European level in light of our experience in COVID-19. Do we need to create competences, mechanisms, institutions which can do these kind of coordination rules, and which are there in a more permanent form, so that they are ready whenever we are getting hit by a crisis like the one we have now?
Thank you very much, Janis. A quick point from you on this, and then we'll move on to the German elections.
Two quick points. One is, I think, if we look back over the past year, who would have thought in March or in April or even later that by the end of the year we would have a vaccine? So I think that's something we should always be reminded of. The principle that the purchase is being done collectively by the member states through the Commission, then obviously every member state is responsible for rolling it out, for implementing their own strategy, because we have no European vaccination strategy, unfortunately, but that's how it is. But I think we've seen some progress, and in a couple of months, I think the debate will also be a different one, because a lot of people will have access to the vaccines, will be vaccinated gradually. So we will find ourselves in a different situation in 3 months than we are now, where we're making comparison to countries like Israel, where the situation is a different one. Second point, I think, and that's the bigger point, referring to the original question you posed, it is how do member states and member states governments deal with hiccups we're having in the process? And what we saw once when we had the first hiccup with the vaccinations, and we're having a hiccup, we're having difficulties, there was an inclination of some to put the blame on the Commission, to say it's not the EU, it's the Commission which has done a bad job. But there were others who were fighting back. And I think this was the right thing to do, because as I said earlier, everyone has to bear responsibility for things at times not working out. So putting the blame on one is far too easy. And thankfully, we saw that when that process started of putting blame on the Commission, there were some government and some heads of government who were fighting back and arguing, stop that, this is not the discussion we should be having.
Which is, as you say, very important at a time like this, because those early impressions in the early days of the health crisis, when we saw that blame game before, it took a long time to undo that damage, particularly in Italy, where there was a sense they'd been forgotten and left to deal with it. So very important that member states, some of them at least, are realizing that they mustn't make that mistake again. So thank you very much for that. We're now going to turn our attention to the German elections, and I'm delighted to welcome Sophie Pornschlegel, Senior Policy Analyst at the EPC, who's joining us for this part of the discussion. And the reason we wanted to talk about this today is, of course, the election of a new CDU party leader, Armin Laschet. We wanted at this point to really try to look at a bit, what does he stand for? What sort of leader is he likely to be? And what could the implications, is he likely to be the candidate for Chancellor come the elections in September? Are they likely to win? And what does all of that mean for Europe? Lots to discuss, not long to do it. Sophie, first of all, paint a picture for us of this man, who he is, what he stands for. I think everyone has said this was a vote for continuity, not change, from Angela Merkel. But what do we know about him, particularly in relation to his attitudes towards the EU?
Yeah. So first of all, thanks for having me. And what you just mentioned about continuity is absolutely right. I think Armin Laschet is known to be the ally of Merkel, to be an integrator within the Conservative Party. And he won the vote also by promoting trust rather than leadership or modernity, like the two other candidates in the party conference last Saturday. So it will definitely be continuity and also trust, and making sure that he ties onto that success of Merkel. So he really wants to continue and make sure that the CDU remains a mainstream large party as it's been with Merkel. He has also a lot of experience in government, being the Minister President of North Rhine-Westphalia. And from an EU perspective, he's known to be very Francophile and very pro-European. So I think from an EU perspective, it's compared to the other candidates, a rather good choice, even though, for instance, Norbert Röttgen has much more experience in foreign policy. He wasn't elected, but maybe if he works with him, it could also work out, because I think on the foreign policy, that's not very much a strong point. He made a few controversial statements concerning Russia and also Syria. So we'll have to see in the coming months how he will develop his foreign policy experience.
Thank you. And I want to come back in a little while. You wrote a commentary recently calling for some reform, some rethinking of CDU foreign policy. I'd like to come back on that, but get an assessment from Fabian and Janis of the man. What sort of leader you think he's going to be? Would this, if he becomes the Chancellor candidate, if he becomes the Chancellor, would this be good news for the EU? And Sophie touched on some points of concern. Some foreign policy areas where there have been question marks, going back to something we touched on in the last session over his attitude towards Viktor Orban and the role of the Fidesz party in the EPP. Fabian, your assessment of the man and what we can expect.
Well, I would actually start not with an assessment of the man, but to say that this is the end of an era. And I think this is something which will have a profound impact, regardless of whether he becomes the candidate for chancellorship, because the one thing we do know is it's not going to be Merkel again. And that is the really significant part of this, that I think most of us cannot imagine a European Union without her at the helm. And for Germany, for the European Union, this will be a profound change. It will inevitably lead to reassessment of Germany. There is an instinctive turning towards Merkel whenever there are substantive discussions. That will not be the case anymore. Of course, Germany remains the largest member state, the economic powerhouse, but it will still be a very different environment in which this takes place. And that will also have implications globally. Whoever is going to be in that seat is not known by the leaders around the world, is not a figure with whom they have dealt with in the past, or who indeed has outlived many of their successors. So this will change Germany and the EU. I think there is a very good chance that the CDU, CSU will be the largest party in the elections in September. But that doesn't necessarily mean that he will be the chancellor. I think this is part of the debate in Germany at the moment. And here, I think what is important to also recognize is that it wasn't so much a resounding victory for Laschet. It was also an assessment on the level of all of the candidates. And he was seen as being the best among the three. But that's not necessarily such a resounding endorsement, given that there were serious questions about the other two.
Just to pick up on your point about it isn't necessarily the case that he'll be chancellor even if they're the biggest party. Is that because you think he might not be the candidate? We've heard of there is a challenge from the CSU leader, there are other CDU figures, so being party leader doesn't equal chancellor candidate? Or is it because you think a coalition might emerge that is not one that gives the CDU the chancellorship? Just to pick up on that, and then I'll come to you, Janis.
I think the chances are that this is about, if you like, the internal cuisine of the CDU-CSU rather than the overall coalition arithmetic. Because when we look at the overall coalitions, at least unless there's a very significant change in the opinion polls, there are not that many options. And all of those options would involve the CDU-CSU as the dominant partner if they become the biggest party. So I think in the end, we are going to see very likely a CDU-CSU candidate, although I would just add the little caveat that for a while it looked like the Greens could come close. It doesn't look like that at the moment, but we still have a few months to go, so I wouldn't completely dismiss it, but it's not the most likely outcome. So I guess the biggest chance at the moment, I would say, is that the leader of the CSU, Schröder, will
That's a blast from the past.
Schröder, not Schröder. That's it.
Doing your
A very important distinction. Indeed, yeah. So the chance is that Markus Söder will be the chancellor. I think is highest.
Okay, thank you. Janis, let's stay then with Armin Laschet. Would you agree with that assessment that it is an open question still who the ultimate Chancellor candidate becomes? But if it is Armin Laschet, we know he's now the party leader, what we know about him and what we don't know, because as I indicated earlier, we don't, for example, know his stance, as I understand it, on Fidesz and the EPP. We do know he's had some controversial views on foreign policy. How do you assess him overall?
Well, first of all, to start with the question you posed earlier to Fabian, I think that given where the CDU found itself with 3 candidates in the second round, 2 candidates with Merz versus Laschet, the fact that Laschet made it from a European perspective was better news than if Friedrich Merz would have become party leader, who I think has difficult positions which he's advocating. He's also more critical, also on European affairs, by the way. And in many ways, and I'll be very harsh now, he often is also a loose gun. And if you have someone who is going to become or potentially become the Chancellor of Germany, what you don't want is to have someone in place who is difficult to calculate. Because if you take into account the almost then 16 years of Angela Merkel, there was a lot of continuity also at European level coming from her. You knew what to expect. She sometimes surprised us, also at national level, but in many ways she was a pole of continuity. That would not have been, I think, the case with respect to Merz. Also in the current crisis, his position with respect to the recovery package, with respect to debt mutualization, to Eurobonds in the past, his position has been more a radical position, not as pro-European, but rather defending some of the more radical European, German economist position, saying this is not the right thing to do. I think that the fact that he made it at the end from a European perspective is good. Now, with respect to what does that mean and with respect to some of the concrete decisions which have to be taken, I think it's far too early to say. So all those who are now saying he has said things on Russia, on Syria, that when he was asked about Orban, he said we need to make sure that we find a way where we keep ourselves united while still adhering to the rule of law. I think one should not draw too quick conclusions from what we've heard from him in view of potentially when he becomes chancellor, so I would be very careful here. The other thing is whether he will become chancellor. Or whether he will become candidate for the chancellery. And I think that's a very open race. So that decision will probably be taken in March, April. In many ways, there are 2 contenders. So it is him, Laschet, or it is the Bavarian Prime Minister, Markus Söder. It's going to be one of the 2. There was some speculation that, maybe even a third one might come up, but that won't be the case. Those who potentially could have qualified have disqualified themselves. So it's going to be either one or the other. And there are some who argue that if you go for Söder, who has much more support at the national level, that would increase the chances of the CDU-CSU doing well in the September elections, and that being the basic logic of taking a decision. But I think from a CDU perspective, that would mean that you would have a CSU party leader who would potentially become chancellor, stay in power for 4, 8, who knows how many years. Is that very attractive from a CDU perspective? I don't think so. So it is very much still an open race. A lot will be determined about how the situation will develop also in Germany with respect to COVID.
And when will we know? When is the decision on the chancellor candidate?
Well, usually we expect that it would happen in March, April.
Right.
But the question is, how would the process evolve? How also consensual will the process be? And if you go back to the times when the last Bavarian CSU member became chancellor candidate, that was a process in which Angela Merkel herself went to that person, Stoiber, and asked him whether he wants to become candidate for the chancellery, knowing that the CDU-CSU would probably not win the elections. Now it's a different ballgame.
Okay.
So it also depends on how consensual the process will be or not.
Okay, I want to come back on the implications for the EU, but Sophie, and you, we don't know, as we said, whether he'll be chancellor candidate or not, but he is the party leader, and as the party leader, drives the policy discussion about where we're going. And as I mentioned earlier, you wrote a very interesting piece about what you thought the CDU should do in terms of its foreign policy, and you called for it to take a stronger, a bolder approach, to be, you pointed out that quite often Angela Merkel was criticized for sort of muddling through, but he is the Merkel continuity candidate. So what do you think he should do, and how likely do you think he is to do it, given this image he has as sort of Merkel Mark II?
Yeah, if I can just come back to things Fabian and Janis said. On Fabian, of course, it's the end of an era, even though I would maybe remark that 16 years in power is quite remarkable and a phenomenon that isn't normal in most democracies. So I would maybe leave the chance to the next candidate and let him build up the experience, because it's also her experience that makes Merkel such an incredible crisis manager. And she probably goes to the European Councils as she goes running every morning, I don't know. So maybe also leave a bit of space to the new candidates to develop and see what they will bring. And concerning Janis's comment on the loose gun of who Laschet might be, it's true. At the same time, from a European perspective, I still think that it will be better to have him as a candidate than Söder, who has also been known to be quite a populistic actor who might change views as he changes socks sometimes, and of course is very well placed in the polls at the moment. But has also less experience. At least Laschet was MEP, and I think his views, we can really trust him to be a pro-European. So when it comes to the CDU's European policy, I think they always say that they're quite pro-European, and that's great. And it's the very traditional, historical pro-European party, always fostering that narrative of peace, prosperity, and security for Europe. But I think that narrative isn't really true now these days. On peace, yes, we have peace, but there's a lot of polarization. When it comes to prosperity, yes, of course, we're one of the richest regions in the world, but there's the COVID-19 crisis and there's a lot of inequality. And when it comes to security, there is a threat of terrorism. So I think that these are issues that you cannot just repeat, and you need to kind of look at the future as well and have a clearer vision of what they want in the future. And it's true that Merkel has been very much muddling through on that. So it would be good for them to have a clearer line and a more comprehensive European policy, which I doubt. I mean, we will see, but I doubt it will come with Laschet. And I think a few things where there is a lot of pressure on them are a few policy fields. You mentioned rule of law. I think Donald Tusk made it pretty clear that he wants a decision from the CDU and that they cannot keep silent and keep their protective hand over Fidesz as they do now in the EPP. There's another one on climate change, and it'd be really interesting to see how Laschet will support the European Green Deal, also knowing that he comes from a very coal-intensive region. He is also the son of a coal miner and very aware of that tradition, I would say. So that's also from a personal position, but we'll see how the CDU positions itself on that. And then on foreign policy as well, Merkel did not like the subject of defense, I would say. She also always left it to others. You could see that also in the rivalry between AKK and Macron on strategic autonomy. Merkel didn't say anything. So I think that's modeling through approach, or like not positioning itself, saying, okay, we'd like to be part of NATO, but we're not talking too much about it in the political debate. That will be more difficult now, also with the new Biden administration, and also the pressure that maybe other EU countries might put on Germany as well to have to give an answer on these issues now. Of course, mentioning China as well. In that case, Laschet hasn't actually positioned himself either. So there's quite a few positionings. He hasn't really said anything, whereas, for instance, Norbert Röttgen and Friedrich Merz, who were the other candidates, were clearly having a clear stance against China, saying that they don't want Huawei to have 5G in Germany. Laschet didn't say anything. So I think there's quite a few things where they will have to have maybe internal discussions on what kind of strategic direction they want to give to the CDU's European policy.
From what you're saying, as if your plea for a bolder approach, a more ambitious approach to EU issues, doesn't sound like Armin Laschet is the sort of person who would go for that.
I think it depends. Maybe the fact that he might be a loose gun might help in that case, as Janis said. That's if he hasn't positioned himself, it's yet to be known. And I think that it depends on the pressure. And I think the conservatives are pretty clear. I mean, Merkel has had that strategy to always go for what the public opinion poll said, or like wait until the public was okay to then take a decision. We'll see what his positioning is. But I think that, for instance, the fact that he's very close to Macron might help in some issues, such as strategic autonomy. I'm not quite sure, but it remains to be seen.
Janis, you wanted to come in here. Let me just read a comment more than a question from Andreas Strignitz, who says, Armin Laschet certainly stands for continuity. The question is whether we can expect more engagement in fields where this is required, in particular in foreign affairs. At least we can say he's very pragmatic and open to compromise. So in that sense, very much Merkel Mark II. But Janis, you wanted to come in.
3 points. The first one is that I think there was a misunderstanding with Sophie here. I was considering that Merz would have been more of a loose gun. If you see how he during his campaign to become party leader, and it was the second time that he tried to become party leader, there were many moments where you could question decisions he had taken, where you can question positions he had taken, and even when he lost on Saturday, the fact that he then rather immediately proposed himself to become the Minister of the Economy and to get rid of Peter Altmaier showed that his way of how he not only views but also judges politics shows that I think that's why I think he would have been more of a loose gun. Second point, whoever will follow Angela Merkel will follow into very big footsteps. And I think that the person, whether it is Laschet, whether it is Söder, or whoever will become the next chancellor, I think that that person will have to prove himself or herself and at the national level first, because the person will be chancellor after someone who had been chancellor for 16 years. So he will have to prove himself at the national level. So I wouldn't expect that you would see massive changes from positions which the CDU-CSU, which Angela Merkel herself had been taking at the European level. So that I think from the beginning, I would not expect that you would see major alterations. And the final point is, when you look at European policymaking, you also obviously have to look at what kind of coalition government we're talking about. So if the assumption from today is that the CDU-CSU is likely to be the biggest party also in the elections in September, which by the way is 9 months to go. So that's a long period in politics, 9 months.
Particularly in the middle of a pandemic.
But in the middle of a crisis, which will also show some of its effect further down the line. But still, from today's perspective, chances are high that the CDU-CSU will be party number one. And then seeking a coalition partner, I would personally argue, and I've said that for a while, that the highest chances are that you will have a black-green coalition. If it is a black-green coalition, then obviously the Greens will have a strong effect on policymaking, including also on European policymaking and external policies beyond the European issues. So also look at that potential coalition when you look at what to expect from the next government / next chancellor.
Thank you. Fabian, want to come in then, Sophie? And can I throw into this mix as well? Please pick up on whatever points you wanted to, but also the question of relations with France and the Franco-German engine and what happens to that in the post-Merkel era, whoever is Chancellor in Germany, and how important that will be. But if you can just weave that into your comments, Fabian, and then Sophie, and then we'll try and draw some conclusions. Fabian.
Just very briefly, I think, of course, whoever comes in needs time to establish themselves, needs time to also develop some of the positions. But I think the important thing here is that we live in a world of crisis, a world of crisis domestically and a world of crisis internationally. So there will be precious little time to settle in, to develop this. I think much of this has to happen now. So I would expect that Laschet will spend a significant part of the next month, not only looking towards the German election, but looking towards the alliances, the partnerships, the external dimension. Because the one thing which Merkel had, and yes, that was partially based on her experience, but she had the political weight to move the dial. If she said this is the direction we are going to go, it was very difficult to go against that momentum. And even at times of very significant challenges to that, as we saw in the migration crisis, in the end, she could still push the whole system in a particular direction. The person who's coming after her will not have that ability.
Indeed.
And I think on the alliance with France, I think we shouldn't forget that France also is facing an election which is actually just over a year from now. I mean, we're not even talking about a very significant period of time. If we look at the German election in September, then we will enter coalition negotiations, which traditionally take some time. This time it could be even more difficult, given that it might be partners which haven't cooperated on the federal level before. So we're probably into January, and then we have the French presidential elections in April.
So we are, the EU is now going to be stuck in a period really from this summer through to next Easter, very much dominated by those two elections. But Sophie, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, just quickly, sorry, Janis, if I got that wrong on the loose gun. It's interesting because I thought you were mentioning him on Syria and on Russia, because I think some of the things that Laschet has mentioned were quite loose gun comments, I would say. For instance, he said that there weren't enough proof for the Skripal case to have sanctions against Russia. So he was seen as a friend of Russia, Russlandversteher, you would say. Which was quite interesting also because the conservatives are not typically, I would say, friends of Russia necessarily, or on Syria, where he was also very critical of the US intervention, saying that they were funding, for instance, the Al-Nusra Fund, which was also completely wrong. So I think it was more on that respect that I mentioned, but it's true that from Friedrich Merz's perspective, on the EU would not have been the best, I think, for the Brussels sphere as such. I think on the French and German relations, Fabian is completely right. So we're basically entering a phase of elections. In France, it looks difficult as well, knowing that there are no strong parties anymore. I mean, there's Macron's parties, but we really don't know. And they are very open cards. So I think we'll have to wait until 2023 to see, for them to get back to work at EU level in that case. And when it comes to the green-black coalition, eventually, I think that's the most likely one you could see now. But also there's a number of regional elections coming up. I mean, in Germany, you talk about a super election year with regional elections that do play an important role in a federal state. So it's Baden-Württemberg, Berlin, Rhineland, Palatinate, for instance. And I think that will also show in which direction some kind of coalitions can move. For instance, in Baden-Württemberg, it's a green-black coalition that works quite well. And I think the Greens are quite keen to enter government this time. Also from a European perspective there, I think it would be rather positive because they have positioned themselves as being quite strongly pro-European. But for instance, that could be more difficult when it comes to rule of law. So I think there will be, they would not accept the CDU to not take a position on Fidesz, for instance.
Okay, before we close, we have 5 minutes left. I want to throw you a bit of a curveball because I want to ask you, and Janis, I'll start with you. Fabian was talking about Merkel having the political weight to move the dial. She moved it domestically, she moved it at EU level. There was always some resentment, that sense that Germany, as the biggest country, as the country that pays the largest share of the bills, has an overdue influence. But Merkel, nevertheless, managed not to ruffle many feathers at EU level because of that respect for her experience, her longevity. What would your advice be to a new chancellor, whoever it is, however it emerges at the end of this, in terms of how Germany should play the game, as it were, at EU level, to go on playing the role of the big member state, the biggest funder of the EU, but without not having, if you like, that respect because of the experience, because of the track record? How does the new chancellor play it right at EU level in order to play the constructive role that Angela Merkel has been able to play through all these years? Is there a formula for doing this? What would your advice be? Same question to you all.
I think my advice would be that whoever becomes the new chancellor should allow himself, I assume that it's going to be allow himself to enter into office, take some time, get used to how to operationalize at the European level, make sure that your leadership position, which Germany has, which is a matter of fact, and that you still don't overstretch being in that leadership position. That you are leading does mean that you also have a higher level of responsibility, that you need to take decisions taking into account the interest of others, that you also should be aware that being in a leadership position is not something which you should shy away from. Because if you look back over the past 20, 30 years, Germany has gone a long way from 89, 90 to where it is now. And it has accepted the fact that it is in a leadership position, but had to redefine that every once in a while. It was different in the first decade after unification than it is now. So that also means that the next chancellor in Germany, you have a lot of continuity. So there's also a good chance that that person will be in office longer than 4 years, that person will adhere to some of the lines where Germany has shown some continuity, while after some time, and that might be even along when the French will be electing their next president, express more of a vision of where he believes Europe should be moving in future. And by the way, by then we will have the magnificent conference on the future of Europe, so there will also be room to discuss these issues at the European level. So continuity with an increasing willingness to develop and share a vision about where things should be moving in the upcoming 10, 20, 30 years.
Thank you. I want to give Sophie the last word. So Fabian, your advice for whoever is Chancellor.
Don't try to be Merkel. I think the key thing here is no one can fill her shoes. But also it is important to recognize that one of the strengths of Angela Merkel has always been her ability to wait things out, to be the last person standing or sitting, to wait until the final moment, and then to put her weight into the winning camp. I think this is something which worked well for her, but also has been criticized. When we're talking about developing a vision for Europe, developing new areas where Europe should be leading, when we're looking back at some of the initiatives from President Macron, which basically fell flat and never went anywhere because they weren't picked up by the German side. So the new leader also has a chance to lead jointly, to bring new things onto the table. I think working together with key allies at the European level and being seen to be working together is very important. And to be pragmatic and overcome some of the German dogma on European policy. But there we always have to bear in mind that this is often about the domestic audience, not the European audience. In the end, one thing which was very clear in this election of the CDU is that the European topics actually played very little. There was hardly any discussion about Europe at all.
Okay.
So in the end, this is about the domestic politics more than the European politics.
Thank you very much. Sophie, last word to you.
Yeah, maybe one point that was interesting is that Laschet was one of the early ones in the Conservative parties to criticize the fact that Germany hadn't responded to Macron in 2017. So I think that's a good sign, and he should continue in that direction, because they should be reactive to partners making proposals. They should show responsibility. They should back the European Commission, has been mentioned. And what was interesting is that in this speech, he talked about the fact that we should have a European Germany, and maybe to end up with a reference to the sociologist Ulrich Beck, the next chancellor should make sure that we have a European Germany and not necessarily a German Europe. And that means also having self-restraint, knowing that there is a leadership position, but making sure they keep that position of honest broker. They did so well in the German Council presidency, and they should maybe continue on that route.
And on that note, thank you so much. Thank you, Sophie. Been great to have you with us. Thank you, Janis and Fabian, as always, for a terrific discussion. Just before we go, I just want to draw your attention to a couple of publications. One that was published yesterday on how the EU can make progress in building a European health union, and one to watch out for coming on Monday on whether corporate debt will choke the post-COVID-19 recovery. And a couple of events to mention next week. On Tuesday, the EU-UK deal, a basis to build on, is the question. And on Thursday, one on EU-US relations, prospects for the transatlantic partnership. Most of us watched that inauguration this week. What does it all really mean? We feel uplifted. What does it mean in concrete terms? And I'll be back with Janis and Fabian on February the 5th in the afternoon again for our next update. So thank you so much for joining us. And it only remains for me to wish you a very pleasant weekend, and do stay safe. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.